There is a kind of intelligence that does not announce itself. It does not carry credentials or demand recognition. It does not raise its hand first in the room or speak the loudest at the table. It moves quietly, reads accurately, and acts at precisely the right moment. You have encountered this intelligence before. You felt it in the presence of someone who never seemed rattled, who always seemed to know something you did not, who made decisions that looked effortless from the outside, but produced results that nobody else could replicate. You walked away from that encounter with a question that stayed with you longer than most questions do. What does that person know that I do not? The honest answer is uncomfortable. It is not that they know more facts. It is not that they studied harder or were born with a different brain. The difference is structural. The architecture underneath their thinking is built differently. They process information at a different layer. They see the thing beneath the thing. They read the room while everyone else is still reading the script. This audiobook is about that architecture. A cleverness, in the way this audiobook defines it, is not raw intelligence. It is applied intelligence. It is the disciplined ability to see clearly, move strategically, and choose precisely in a world that rewards those who think at a deeper level than the situation demands. It is also one of the most misunderstood capacities a person can develop. Most people assume cleverness is something you either have or you do not. A trait inherited, fixed, baked into personality from birth. That assumption is wrong. It is wrong in a way that is costing people dearly, every single day, in decisions made from habit instead of insight, in opportunities missed because the thinking underneath was not sharp enough to recognize them, in relationships and negotiations, and moments of pressure where the wrong mental framework produced the wrong result. Cleverness is learnable, but it is not learned the way most people expect. It is not a list of tactics. It is not a collection of clever things to say. It is a set of perceptual shifts, ways of orienting your mind to reality that change what you notice, how you interpret what you notice, and what you do with that interpretation. By the end of this audiobook, you will not simply know more about thinking. You will think differently. You will begin to catch yourself mid-assumption, mid-reaction, mid-pattern, and choose a sharper response. That is the promise of this work. But there is a warning built into that promise. The same capacities that make a person genuinely clever make them dangerous to themselves if they are developed without discipline. A sharp mind without a stable foundation does not produce wisdom. It produces precision in the service of the wrong ends. So this audiobook will teach the skill and the restraint simultaneously. Because the goal is not to become clever for the sake of cleverness. The goal is to become the kind of person whose intelligence serves something real. That journey begins now. Chapter 1. The difference between smart and clever. There is a test that most people never realize they are taking. It happens in boardrooms and at dinner tables. It happens in the middle of arguments and at the edge of decisions. It happens in the silence after someone speaks and in the moment before someone responds. The test is not about knowledge. It is not about credentials or vocabulary or the number of books sitting on a shelf. The test is this: can you see what is actually happening? Not what appears to be happening. Not the surface version that everyone in the room is reacting to. The actual thing, the real dynamic, the force underneath the situation that is quietly determining every outcome. Smart people fail this test more often than they realize. And that failure, invisible, chronic, and expensive, is the reason intelligence alone has never been enough. Here is the distinction that changes everything. Smart is a measure of capacity. It describes how much processing power a mind possesses, how quickly it absorbs information, how efficiently it stores and retrieves. Smart is the engine, and engines by themselves do not determine where you go. They determine only how fast you travel, in whatever direction you happen to be pointed. Clever is something different. Clever is orientation. It is the capacity to point the engine in the right direction, at the right moment, for the right reason. Clever is what determines whether your intelligence is working for you or simply running efficiently in place. This distinction sounds simple. It is not simple in practice. because the entire educational and professional architecture of modern life rewards smart and ignores clever. It rewards the accumulation of correct answers. It does not reward the rarer and more valuable ability to ask better questions. It rewards speed of execution. It does not reward the discipline to pause before executing. It rewards demonstrated knowledge. It does not reward the capacity to sit with uncertainty and read what is actually true. The result is a world full of highly capable people making poor decisions. Not poor decisions because they lacked information. Poor decisions because they were asking the wrong questions, reading the wrong signals, solving the wrong problems with enormous precision and energy. Consider what happens when a genuinely smart person enters a complicated situation. The intelligence activates immediately. It begins processing, categorizing, identifying patterns, reaching conclusions. This is a remarkable capability, but it carries a hidden cost. The faster a mind reaches conclusions, the less time it spends at the most important layer, the layer of perception. Perception is where the real work happens, before analysis, before strategy, before any decision at all. Perception is the act of seeing clearly, not seeing what you expect to see, not seeing what confirms what you already believe, seeing what is actually present in the room, in the conversation, in the relationship, in the problem. This is a discipline that intelligence can actually interfere with, because a fast, confident mind tends to skip perception and move directly to processing. It assumes it already knows what it is looking at. And that assumption is where most intelligent failures are born. Clever minds do something different. They slow down at the layer of perception before they accelerate anywhere else. They treat the act of seeing as a skill that requires deliberate effort, not a passive input that happens automatically. They know that the quality of every decision downstream depends entirely on the quality of the perception at the source. This is why two people of equivalent intelligence, facing the same situation, can reach completely different outcomes. The difference is rarely in the intelligence itself. The difference is in what each person actually saw when they looked at the situation. There is another dimension to this distinction that rarely gets examined. Smart is largely static. It can be developed to a point, trained and refined, but its ceiling is relatively fixed by a combination of factors that are not entirely within your control. Clever has no fixed ceiling. It is a practice. It deepens with deliberate attention. It compounds over time. Every situation in which you train yourself to see more clearly makes the next situation more legible. This means that cleverness is the more democratic of the two capacities. It is available to anyone willing to develop it, and it consistently outperforms raw intelligence in the environments that matter most. Environments defined by ambiguity, complexity, social dynamics, and incomplete information, which is to say, real life. The following chapters of this audiobook are concerned with cleverness in precisely this sense. Not tricks, not shortcuts, not a catalogue of tactics to deploy in difficult conversations. The architecture, the perceptual habits, the thinking disciplines, the practiced orientations that, built together over time, produce the kind of mind that sees more clearly, moves more precisely, and makes better decisions in conditions where most intelligent people are still trying to figure out what they are actually looking at. The starting point for all of it is perception, and perception begins with learning to read what most people in every room are missing entirely. Chapter 2. The first perceptual shift. Reading what is not said language is the least reliable thing happening in any conversation. That statement will feel wrong at first. Language is, after all, the primary vehicle of human communication. Words carry meaning. Sentences convey ideas. Arguments are built from propositions that connect in logical sequence. This is what communication is, or so the dominant assumption goes. But anyone who has spent serious time studying how human beings actually interact, not how they theoretically interact, but what is actually occurring in real exchanges between real people, arrives at the same uncomfortable conclusion. The words are frequently the least informative part of what is happening. What the words say and what the interaction means are often two entirely different things. The person who understands this has access to a layer of information that most people never reach. And access to that layer changes everything about how they move through conversations, relationships, negotiations, and rooms. Consider what is actually present in any given interaction. There are the words, yes, but beneath and around the words, there is a continuous stream of other information. The pace at which someone speaks and where that pace changes, the physical space they occupy and how they manage it when challenged, the emotions they display and, more revealingly, the emotions they are working to conceal, the questions they do not ask, the topics they allow to pass without comment, the moments when precision suddenly gives way to vagueness. Each of these carries information, dense, specific, often more honest than anything the words themselves convey. Because words are chosen, they are curated, edited, shaped by intention, filtered through social awareness, calibrated for effect. Everything else, the pace, the posture, the silence, the vagueness, tends to emerge from a layer of behavior that operates faster than conscious management can intercept. This is the layer that clever minds read. The first skill required is not complex. It is simply the willingness to listen at two levels simultaneously. The first level is the surface, what is being said. The second level is the structure, what the pattern of how it is being said reveals about what is actually true. Most people listen only at the first level. They take in the content of words and respond to that content. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of orientation. They have never been trained to notice that the second level exists, let alone how to read it. Begin with silence. Silence is the most under-examined signal in human communication. Most people experience silence as an absence, a gap between information, a pause to be filled. The clever mind experiences silence as data. Every silence has a quality. The silence that follows a question someone expected is different from the silence that follows a question they did not expect. The silence that precedes an honest answer is different from the silence that precedes a constructed one. The silence of someone thinking is different from the silence of someone deciding how much to reveal. When you begin treating silence as signal rather than gap, you begin receiving information that almost nobody else in the room is collecting. Then there is vagueness. Vagueness is one of the most reliable indicators available in conversation. When a person who has been speaking with specificity suddenly becomes general, something has shifted. When direct questions receive answers that technically respond without actually informing, the gap between the question and the answer is where the real information lives. Clever minds notice that gap. They do not always name it, and they do not always respond to it immediately. But they register it, file it, and allow it to inform everything that follows. Watch also for the moment when someone's language and their physiology diverge. Agreement spoken with a body that is pulling back. Confidence asserted by a voice that has dropped in pace and volume. Dismissal expressed with more energy than genuine dismissal requires. These divergences are not always intentional. They are often the product of a nervous system responding to reality faster than conscious language can follow. And they are extraordinarily revealing to the person paying attention at the right level. There is a discipline required to develop this kind of perception, and it is counterintuitive. The instinct of an active, intelligent mind in conversation is to be preparing the next thing to say, to be building the response, anticipating the argument, organizing the counter. This instinct is the enemy of deep listening. It consumes the attention that accurate perception requires. The deliberate practice of this perceptual shift involves, first, training yourself to be genuinely quiet inside while someone else is speaking. Not quiet in the sense of not talking, quiet in the sense of not internally constructing. The mind that is already building its response cannot simultaneously read the signals being transmitted by the person in front of it. These are competing activities, and the one that tends to dominate is the one that feels more urgent. The practice is in reversing that priority. Second, it requires developing the habit of asking one specific internal question in every significant conversation. What is this person most carefully not saying? Not what they are saying. what they are not saying, what they are moving around, moving past, allowing to remain unnamed. The shape of the omission is often more diagnostic than the content of what is present. This is not paranoia. It is calibration. People are not hiding things because they are dishonest. They are managing information because everyone manages information. They are protecting something, a position, a vulnerability, an intention, a fear. The direction in which they manage information tells you something precise about what they are protecting. And what they are protecting tells you something precise about what actually matters to them. When you can read that layer consistently, you are no longer responding to what people say. You are responding to what is true. And those two things, in the most consequential conversations of your life, are frequently not the same. Chapter 3. Pattern recognition as a survival skill. Every situation you have ever navigated has happened before. Not identically. Not in the same setting, with the same people, producing the same words, but underneath the surface details, underneath the specific names and circumstances, the structure of what was happening, the dynamic at work, the force moving through the situation has appeared many times before in many different forms. The clever mind knows this. The untrained mind does not. And the distance between those two orientations is the distance between being perpetually surprised by life and being rarely surprised by anything that matters. Potential recognition is not a passive talent. It is not something that some people simply have and others do not. It is a practiced attentiveness to the recurring shapes that human behavior, power, conflict, and consequence tend to take. And it is one of the most practically powerful capacities a person can develop. Here is why it matters at the level of survival. Most people respond to events. Something happens, and they react to that specific thing, its particular features, its immediate emotional weight, its surface characteristics. This is the default mode of human cognition. It is fast, emotionally responsive, and catastrophically short-sighted, because the event is never just an event. It is always an instance of something larger, a move in a sequence, a symptom of a pattern, a visible ripple produced by a force that began moving long before the ripple appeared. When you respond only to the event, you are always behind. You are always reacting to the current moment, which means you have already surrendered whatever advantage anticipation could have provided. You are managing what has already happened rather than positioning yourself for what is coming. Pot-sparred recognition shifts that entirely. When you see not just the event but the pattern the event belongs to, you are no longer confined to reaction. You can see the sequence. You can anticipate the next move. You can position yourself before the next ripple arrives. This is not mysticism. It is observation accumulated and organized. Every person in your life is running patterns, not deliberately, not consciously, and not with any awareness that they are doing it. Behavior tends to repeat because behavior is largely driven by underlying orientations. Emotional patterns, relational habits, defensive reflexes, motivational structures that remain remarkably consistent across time and across different surface circumstances. The friend who always withdraws when conflict approaches does so, in every context where conflict approaches, regardless of who is involved or what the stakes are. The colleague who claims credit in public and deflects blame in private does so consistently because it is not a situational choice. It is a structural habit of self-protection. The person who pursues closeness urgently and then disappears when it is achieved is running a pattern that will repeat with every person they encounter who allows it. Seeing these patterns early is the difference between being shaped by them and choosing how to navigate them. The skill develops in layers. The first layer is retrospective. You begin training the recognition capacity by examining your own history with precision. Not the emotional history, not what things felt like, but the structural history. What kinds of situations have appeared repeatedly? What recurring dynamics have produced recurring outcomes? What moves has your own behavior made, again and again, that you have mistaken for independent responses to independent circumstances? This retrospective examination is genuinely uncomfortable. It requires sitting with the realization that what felt like individual choices were often instances of a habit. But the discomfort is the price of the insight. And the insight is this: if your behavior has run patterns in the past, it is running them now. The question is whether you are directing the pattern or being carried by it. The second layer is observational. This is the practice of watching other people's behavior, not as a sequence of individual actions, but as a developing structure. The key discipline is restraint from early interpretation. Most people observe one or two actions and immediately construct a narrative. They reached a conclusion and then, because the brain is a confirmation machine, they find subsequent evidence to support it. Pattern recognition requires more patience. You observe longer before you conclude. You let the structure become visible through accumulation, rather than forcing it from a sample too small to be reliable. 3 instances are more reliable than 1. 6 are more reliable than 3. The patient observer who waits for the pattern to declare itself through repetition is operating at a fundamentally different level of accuracy than the reactive observer who interprets the first signal and stops looking. The third layer is predictive. This is where the skill becomes genuinely powerful. Once you have identified a pattern accurately, you can use it, not to manipulate, to navigate. You know what this person tends to do under this kind of pressure. You know what this organization tends to produce in this kind of situation. You know what this dynamic tends to generate when it reaches a certain threshold of intensity. This knowledge allows you to position yourself appropriately before the predictable thing happens. This is not cynicism. Cynicism assumes the worst without evidence. Pattern recognition assumes only what the evidence has established. The distinction matters enormously because cynicism closes perception. It stops looking once it has confirmed its existing belief, while genuine pattern recognition remains open. It can update, it can revise, it will follow the evidence wherever the evidence leads, even when that leads to a more generous conclusion than the initial pattern suggested. The final thing to understand about pattern recognition is that it requires protecting the quality of your own attention. Patterns are subtle. They reveal themselves to minds that are watching carefully and quietly. They are invisible to minds that are overwhelmed, reactive, or too personally invested in a particular conclusion to see what is actually there. This is why the practices that seem abstract, managing your emotional reactivity, developing genuine patience, building the ability to observe without immediately interpreting, are not soft skills. They are the prerequisites for the most practically powerful thinking you can do. You cannot see what is coming if you are too busy reacting to what just arrived. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Strategic Patience. Speed has never been rarer than it is now. Every system surrounding modern life is optimized for velocity. Information arrives faster than it can be processed. Decisions are expected before understanding has had time to form. Responses are demanded before reflection has had any room to operate. The architecture of contemporary life is built deliberately and efficiently to reward whoever moves fastest and punish whoever takes time to think. This architecture is producing a specific and largely invisible casualty. Timing, speed, and timing are not the same thing. They are not even close to the same thing. Speed is a measure of how quickly you act. Timing is a measure of when you act. These two capacities not only differ, they often directly conflict, because the conditions required to move with genuine timing are frequently incompatible with the conditions that produce speed. Timing requires patience, the specific, disciplined, unsentimental kind of patience that is not waiting out of weakness or indecision, but waiting because the moment has not yet arrived. The patience of someone who knows exactly what they are waiting for and has the composure to remain still until it appears. This kind of patience is extraordinarily rare, and its rarity is precisely what makes it so valuable. Consider the architecture of any significant outcome you have witnessed, in negotiation, in leadership, in conflict, in the development of anything that actually lasted. Look at the moves that mattered most. Almost invariably, they were not the fastest moves. They were the most precisely timed moves, made not by the person who acted first, but by the person who waited until the conditions were right and then acted with decisive commitment. The person who speaks first in a silence they cannot tolerate has surrendered information and leverage to the person who was comfortable remaining quiet. The person who makes a concession before their counterpart has reached the pressure point where concession becomes necessary, has given away value they did not need to give. The person who responds to provocation in the moment the provocation is designed to produce has handed control of the exchange to whoever designed the provocation. In each of these cases, the cost is not slowness. The cost is poor timing. And poor timing produced by the inability to wait produces losses that no subsequent speed can recover. Strategic patience is not inaction. This is the most important distinction to establish clearly, because patience is frequently misunderstood as a passive state, an absence of movement, a suspension of agency. It is none of those things. Strategic patience is intensely active. It is the activity of continuous observation, ongoing assessment, and deliberate preparation during the period before the right moment arrives. The patient person is not waiting in stillness. They are watching, reading, learning, positioning. They are doing the work that the impatient person skips in their rush to act. And when the moment finally arrives, when the conditions align, when the opening appears, when the leverage is maximum, they move with a completeness and precision that the person who acted early can never produce, because they have not done the work that patience required. There is also a psychological dimension to strategic patience that is rarely discussed but enormously consequential. Patience signals something to every person watching. It signals that you are not desperate. And desperation in any negotiation, any relationship, any competitive context is the most expensive thing you can broadcast. Desperation says, I need this to happen. I need it now. I will pay whatever the cost of having it now is, because the alternative, waiting, tolerating uncertainty, accepting that I may not get what I want on my preferred timeline, is worse than the overpayment. Patience says something entirely different. It says, I am comfortable with uncertainty. I am not operating from need. I will wait until the conditions favor me, and I will not compromise that advantage for the sake of ending my discomfort sooner. These two signals produce entirely different responses in the people receiving them. Desperation invites pressure. Patience commands respect, and the person who has genuinely built the capacity to wait, not as a performance but as a practiced discipline, holds a quality of leverage that no tactic can manufacture. Developing strategic patience requires confronting something honest about yourself. It requires examining the specific flavors of discomfort that cause you to move before you should. For most people, there are a small number of identifiable triggers: the discomfort of silence, the anxiety of uncertainty, the social pressure of appearing inactive, the fear that the opportunity will disappear if they do not act on it immediately. Each of these triggers is a mechanism through which other people and circumstances can pull you out of position. When you know your triggers precisely, you can recognize the moment they are activating and choose to hold still anyway. That choice, made repeatedly and deliberately in the face of genuine discomfort, is how the architecture of patience is built, not through intention, through practice, through the accumulated experience of waiting when everything in you wanted to move, and discovering, again and again, that what was available after the wait was worth more than what was available before it. Timing cannot be fabricated. It can only be earned by the person who develops the discipline to wait for it. Chapter 5. How the clever think about problems. The wrong problem, solved brilliantly, produces the wrong result. This sentence should be obvious. It is not, in practice, treated as obvious by most intelligent people facing real situations under real pressure, because the instinct, powerful, almost universal, and deeply rewarded by most institutional environments, is to begin solving the problem that presents itself, the visible problem, the named problem, the one sitting on the surface of the situation, demanding a response. The cleverness required to stop before engaging with that visible problem, to question whether it is actually the problem that matters, is rarer and more valuable than any problem-solving capability that comes after it. There is a specific cognitive trap at work here. Psychologists call it the framing effect. The way a problem is presented to a mind powerfully shapes what solutions that mind considers. When a problem is framed as a resource allocation question, the mind generates resource allocation solutions. When the same underlying situation is framed as a communication failure, the mind generates communication solutions. The framing is not neutral. It is a set of invisible rails that channel thinking in specific directions and away from others. Most people accept the framing they receive. They walk into the room, find a problem already defined and waiting for them, and begin working within the frame without ever examining the frame itself. This is not laziness. It is the natural response to a situation that presents itself as already diagnosed, a situation that says, in its very structure, the question has been identified, we need only the answer. Clever minds resist this, not reflexively, not as a performance of contrarianism, but because they have learned, through sufficient experience with the expensive consequences of solving the wrong problem brilliantly, that the definition of the problem is the most consequential decision in any problem-solving sequence. Get it wrong and no subsequent work compensates. The first move of genuinely clever problem thinking is not to generate solutions. It is to generate better questions about the problem itself. What is the actual source of this situation? Not the presenting symptom, the source. What would have to be true for this to be happening? What changed? What did not change when everything else did? Who benefits from the current definition of this problem? And does their interest in that definition tell us something about whether the definition is accurate? These questions feel slow. They feel indulgent when there is pressure to produce answers. And that pressure, the social and institutional pressure to move quickly from problem to solution, to demonstrate capability through the speed of one's response, is the force that most consistently prevents accurate diagnosis. Consider the difference between two responses to a team that is consistently missing deadlines. The first response accepts the presented problem. The team is not managing its time effectively. It generates solutions from within that frame, better project management tools, tighter checkpoints, clearer accountability structures. These solutions may produce marginal improvement. But if the actual problem is that the team is working from constantly shifting requirements provided by leadership with insufficient information, if the deadline failures are a symptom of an upstream clarity problem, not a time management problem, then every solution generated from the wrong frame will be both expensive and inadequate. The second response refuses the immediate frame. It asks what is actually producing the deadline failures. It examines the problem from multiple angles before committing to a definition. It discovers the upstream clarity failure, and it generates solutions that address the actual source, with consequences that compound differently and last longer. Same situation, same pressure, completely different quality of thinking. The second cognitive habit of clever problem thinking is what might be called level shifting. Every problem exists at multiple levels simultaneously. There is the level of immediate symptoms. There is the level of the system producing those symptoms. There is the level of the values and incentives that built the system. Clever minds develop the practice of moving between these levels deliberately, asking at each level, is the leverage point here, or somewhere above or below where I am currently looking? Most interventions happen at the symptom level because symptoms are visible and the pressure to address visible things is high. But solutions applied at the symptom level, while the system producing the symptoms remains unchanged, will produce recurring versions of the same problem. The symptom is managed, then it returns because its source was never addressed. Moving to the system level requires more patience, more abstraction, and a willingness to accept that the solution will take longer to produce visible results. This willingness is itself a discipline, because the expectation in most environments, and in most people's own psychological relationship with their problems, is that a good solution should produce fast visible improvement. That expectation is one of the most reliable mechanisms for generating shallow interventions. The third habit is one of radical skepticism about your first understanding of any problem, not permanent skepticism, not the refusal to ever commit to a definition, but a deliberate holding of the initial interpretation lightly enough that new information can revise it. The first understanding of any complex problem is almost always incomplete. It is built from the information available in the first moment of contact with the situation, which is typically the most curated, most surface level, most strategically presented version of what is actually occurring. Subsequent information, gathered from different sources, from different vantage points, from the person most invested in a particular framing not being in the room, consistently reveals dimensions that were absent from the initial picture. The mind that commits hard to its first interpretation stops gathering information that would revise it. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a feature of how cognition works under pressure. Once a definition is formed, the mind begins working within it, and information that does not fit the definition is quietly deprioritized. The clever mind builds a deliberate practice of holding definitions open longer, asking what this interpretation is missing, and treating revision not as a sign of error, but as a sign of honesty. Solving the right problem with ordinary means produces better outcomes than solving the wrong problem with exceptional means. The cleverness is not in the solving, it is in the seeing, and the seeing begins with refusing the problem, as it was handed to you long enough to determine whether the handoff was accurate. Chapter 6. The discipline of not reacting. There is a moment that exists in every high-stakes exchange. It lasts less than 2 seconds. It arrives after something has been said or done that carries emotional weight. A provocation, a challenge, an insult, an unexpected move, an accusation that lands close to something true. In that moment, the body has already decided what it wants to do. The nervous system has read the stimulus and generated a response. The response is loaded, ready, pressing toward expression. What happens in that moment, the 2 seconds between stimulus and response, determines more about the outcome of the exchange than anything else that follows. Most people are not aware that the moment exists. They experience the stimulus and the response as a single continuous event. Something happened and they reacted. The gap between the two is so small, so unconscious, so thoroughly owned by habit, that it does not register as a space in which a choice was available. The discipline of not reacting is the practice of making that gap visible, then making it wider, then filling it with something more useful than the automatic response that the nervous system had prepared. This is not the suppression of emotion. That distinction is critical because suppression and discipline are frequently confused, and they produce entirely different results. Suppression is the act of pushing a response down while it continues generating internal pressure, a compression that accumulates energy and tends to release in less controlled and often more damaging forms later. Discipline is something structurally different. It is the redirection of the energy generated by the stimulus through a different cognitive pathway before the response is formed. The suppressed person is still being governed by the original impulse. They are simply not displaying it yet. The disciplined person has genuinely rerouted the processing. They are no longer inside the emotional response. They are observing it from a position of sufficient distance to choose what to do with it. That distance is built through practice. It does not arrive through intention alone. Consider what the uncontrolled reaction actually costs in the contexts where it most frequently appears. In negotiation, the reactive person announces their emotional investment in every move they make that is not carefully chosen. The frustration that surfaces when an offer is declined tells the other party exactly where the threshold of discomfort is. And experienced negotiators use that information immediately and deliberately. The excitement that surfaces when a favorable term is offered tells the other party that the term carries more value than they may have realized, and the offer adjusts accordingly. Every uncontrolled reaction is a transmission of information about your interior state, to someone who may have an interest in using that information against you. Reaction is currency. Spending it carelessly is one of the most common and costly habits in high-stakes interaction. In leadership, the reactive leader creates an environment shaped around their emotional weather. Teams learn to read the leader's mood before they bring problems forward. They learn which information is safe to deliver and which will be met with a response that makes delivery dangerous. They begin filtering what reaches the leader, based not on what the leader needs to know, but on what the leader's reactions make it safe to say. The leader, operating inside their own reactive patterns, never sees this filtration happening. They only experience its downstream effects. A team that seems less forthcoming than it should be, information that arrives later than it should, surprises that feel avoidable in retrospect. The reactive leader did not intend any of this. The reactions did it on their behalf, systematically, over time without announcement. In personal relationships, uncontrolled reactivity creates a specific and self-reinforcing dynamic. The person who reacts to provocation with consistent emotional intensity becomes predictable, and predictability, in any relationship where power is being negotiated, consciously or not, is a vulnerability. The person who knows exactly how to produce a specific emotional response in you possesses a kind of leverage that requires no sophistication to use and no effort to maintain. They press the button. The response arrives. The cycle continues because it keeps working. The moment you become genuinely unpredictable in your responses, not erratic, not cold, but genuinely free from the automatic patterns that used to govern your reactions, the dynamic shifts. The buttons that used to work stop working. The provocations that used to produce reliable responses begin landing in silence. And silence, as the previous chapter explored, carries its own weight and its own influence. The practice of building this discipline begins with identification. Before you can interrupt a pattern, you have to know the pattern precisely. This requires honest retrospective examination, not of what you felt in reactive moments, but of the specific triggers, the recurring stimuli, the particular categories of event that most reliably produce uncontrolled responses. For most people, the list is shorter than expected. The triggers are not infinitely varied. They cluster around a small number of core sensitivities: feeling disrespected, feeling excluded, feeling controlled, feeling inadequate, feeling unseen. The specific events that activate these sensitivities vary widely. The underlying sensitivities themselves are remarkably consistent. When you know your sensitivities precisely, you can recognize the moment of activation early enough to intervene. Not after the response has already formed, at the point where the stimulus is being processed, before the automatic pathway has fully engaged. The intervention is not complicated. It is a single act, the deliberate insertion of time between stimulus and response, a breath, a pause, a decision to observe the impulse rather than become it, a moment in which you choose to watch what your nervous system is preparing rather than automatically executing its preparation. That pause is the entire practice, in its most essential form. Over time, through repetition in progressively higher stakes situations, the pause becomes available earlier in the process, lasts longer naturally, and produces a more reliable quality of response. The response that emerges from a disciplined pause is categorically different from the response that emerges from automaticity. It is chosen rather than compelled. It serves your actual interests rather than your immediate emotional state. It is a move rather than a reaction. And in any exchange where moves and reactions are both present, the person making moves holds a structural advantage over the person having reactions. There is one further dimension to this discipline that deserves careful attention. The person who has genuinely developed the capacity not to react becomes difficult to read. And a person who is difficult to read is difficult to manage, difficult to manipulate, and difficult to predict. This quality, call it opacity, is not manufactured through performance. It is the natural consequence of genuine internal discipline. When your responses are no longer automatic, they are no longer legible in the way that automatic responses are legible. The person watching you cannot read your interior state from your exterior behavior because your exterior behavior is no longer a direct transmission of your interior state. It is a chosen signal, and chosen signals carry only what you decide to transmit. This is where the discipline of not reacting connects to everything downstream in this audiobook, because the capacity to choose your signal, rather than having your signal chosen for you by your nervous system's automatic processing, is the foundation of every more sophisticated practice that follows. You cannot read a room well while being moved by it. You cannot see patterns clearly while being a participant in them. You cannot exercise leverage while being leveraged. Every chapter from this point forward assumes a degree of internal discipline as its foundation. Build the pause first. Everything else is built on top of it. Chapter 7. Reading people without being read. Every person you meet is carrying two versions of themselves into the room. The first version is the presented self, the curated, managed, intentionally constructed projection of who they want to be perceived as. This version is aware of being observed. It has prepared, it knows its lines, it has selected which qualities to display and which to keep behind the presentation. The second version is the leaking self, the one that emerges in the gaps between managed moments, in the micro-expression that crosses a face before the composed response forms, in the slight shift of posture when a specific topic enters the conversation, in the way energy changes when a particular name is mentioned, in the sentence that begins in one direction and quietly corrects itself into safer territory. The first version is what most people see. The second version is what the conversation is actually about. Reading people accurately is not about cynicism, suspicion, or the assumption that everyone is concealing something dangerous. Most people are simply managing their presentation the way everyone manages their presentation, protecting vulnerabilities, curating images, navigating the complex social economics of what to reveal and when. This is not deception. It is the normal behavior of any person who has learned that not everything about them is safe to display in every context. What it means, practically, is that the surface of any person is never the complete picture, and the gap between the surface and the complete picture is where genuine understanding lives. The first principle of reading people without being read is patience of observation. Most people reach their conclusions about others quickly, within the first few minutes of contact, and then spend the remainder of the interaction confirming those conclusions rather than continuing to observe. This is the brain's natural efficiency mechanism at work. Continuous open assessment is cognitively expensive. Confirmation is cheap. So the brain defaults to confirmation as quickly as it can establish something to confirm. The deliberate practice runs against this default. It extends the observation window. It treats early impressions as hypotheses rather than verdicts. It keeps looking after the first signal because the most revealing signals tend to emerge later, when the managed performance has had time to require more maintenance energy than the person can sustain, and the leaking begins. The second principle is watching for consistency between different channels of expression simultaneously. Words are one channel, tone is another, body language is a third. Micro-expressions, the involuntary, sub-second facial movements that precede composed expression, constitute a fourth. The energy with which someone occupies space, the pace at which they move and speak, the way they manage eye contact when specific topics arise. Each is a separate channel carrying its signal. Accurate reading requires monitoring multiple channels at once and, critically, noticing when they align and when they diverge. When channels align, you are likely seeing something genuine, a state that is consistent across both the managed and unmanaged levels of expression. When channels diverge, when the words say one thing and the body says something structurally incompatible, you are in the most informative territory available. The divergence tells you that the person is managing a gap between what is true and what they are presenting. The direction of the divergence tells you something about what is being managed. The person who says they are not concerned about something while their hands have stopped their habitual movement and their voice has shifted. A fraction higher in register is managing concern. The person who insists they are satisfied with an arrangement, while their eye contact has shortened and their answers have become notably more brief, is managing dissatisfaction. In each case, the words are the presentation, the body is the signal. This brings us to the third principle, baseline awareness. Every person has a behavioral baseline, the habitual patterns of expression, movement, pace, and posture that characterize their normal state. Reading deviation is only possible against that baseline. A person who speaks quickly all the time is not necessarily concealing anything when they speak quickly under pressure. A person who speaks slowly and begins to accelerate when a specific topic arises is displaying a meaningful deviation. This is why genuine reading requires observation across time and across context before conclusions are drawn. The first interaction establishes some initial data. Subsequent interactions reveal the baseline more clearly. And once the baseline is clear, deviations become legible, not as proof of specific internal states, but as signals worth noting and sitting with. The fourth principle is the strategic use of your own silence and space. This connects back to the previous chapter in an important way. The most effective reader of other people is typically also the most disciplined manager of their own transmission. When you speak less, others speak more. And when others speak more, they provide more data. The person who fills every silence with words is not gathering information, they are providing it. The person who allows silences to rest, who asks genuine questions, and then remains genuinely quiet in a way that does not rush the answer, who creates enough space in a conversation for the other person to move beyond their prepared lines and into something more unguarded. That person is consistently gathering more accurate information than anyone else in the room. Questions, used well, are the most powerful reading tools available. But the quality of the question matters enormously. Closed questions produce managed answers. They give the other person a clear track to respond along, and managed people navigate tracks expertly. Open questions, genuinely open, without an embedded direction or a suggested answer, require the other person to choose their own path. And the path they choose tells you something about their priorities, their sensitivities, their current orientation, that no closed question would have produced. There is an ethical dimension to all of this that requires direct acknowledgement. The capacity to read people accurately is a form of power. Like all forms of power, it can be exercised in service of genuine understanding and connection, or it can be deployed as a tool of extraction and manipulation. The difference lies entirely in the intention behind the reading and in what is done with the information it produces. The ethical reader uses understanding to connect more honestly, to serve more accurately, to navigate relationships with more genuine care for what the other person actually needs. The exploitative reader uses the same understanding to identify pressure points and apply pressure to them. This audiobook is concerned exclusively with the first application. Understanding people more accurately. Reading beneath the surface with patience and precision is one of the most profound forms of respect a person can offer, because it treats the other person as something more complex and more real than their presentation suggests. It honors the full human being rather than the curated projection. The final principle in this chapter is perhaps the most important, and it comes in the form of a warning that the best readers consistently give themselves. You are also a person. You also have a baseline, deviations, leaking signals, and divergences between channels. You are also being read by whoever in any given room has developed the capacity to read. The discipline of reading others must always be paired with the discipline of managing your own transmission. Not through performance, not through the construction of a false presentation, through the genuine internal discipline that produces consistency between what you are and what you project, which is the only presentation that holds under sustained pressure and sophisticated observation. The person who reads accurately and transmits honestly is the most formidable presence in any room. They see clearly, they cannot easily be deceived, And because their own signal is genuine, they cannot easily be caught in the contradiction between presentation and reality that every constructed persona eventually produces. Ride deeply, transmit honestly, and never forget that the same principles governing your observation of others are simultaneously governing someone else's observation of you. Chapter 8. The leverage of selective disclosure. Information moves in one direction once you have revealed something: a position, a vulnerability, an intention, a desire, a fear, a limit. It cannot be unrevealed. It exists now in the awareness of whoever received it. It will shape how they think about you, how they approach you, and what moves they make in relation to you. The transfer is permanent, and the consequence of that permanence is that every disclosure in any significant interaction is a decision with an irreversible character. Most people do not experience disclosure as a decision. They experience it as a natural feature of conversation. The organic exchange of information between people who are engaging honestly with one another. And in many contexts, that organic exchange is exactly right. It is how trust is built. It is how genuine relationships deepen. It is how understanding between people develops over time. But there is a different category of context: negotiations, competitive environments, early-stage relationships where trust has not yet been established. Situations where other parties have distinct interests that may conflict with yours. Where the organic exchange of information, governed by social instinct rather than deliberate judgment, consistently produces disadvantageous outcomes for the person who discloses more than the situation requires. Selective disclosure is the practice of bringing deliberate judgment to what you reveal, to whom you reveal it, and when the revelation occurs. It is not deception. It is not the construction of a false picture. It is the understanding that you are never obligated to share everything you know, everything you feel, or everything you intend. And that the decision about what to share should be made unconsciously rather than surrendered to social momentum. The first dimension of selective disclosure is positional. In any interaction where something is being negotiated, and this category is broader than most people recognize, extending far beyond formal negotiations into almost every significant conversation where interests are involved. Your position is the single most valuable piece of information you possess. Your real position, what you actually need, what you would genuinely accept, where your actual limits are. Not the presented position, which is your opening offer. The real one, the moment your real position becomes visible to the other party, the negotiation is effectively over. They will bring you to your limit because they can see where your limit is. The gap between your opening offer and your real position, that gap is where value lives, where outcomes are determined, where the quality of every agreement is set. Protecting that gap through disciplined non-disclosure is not dishonesty. It is basic competence. The second dimension is temporal. The same piece of information carries different weight and produces different effects depending on when it is introduced into a conversation. Information revealed early, before context has been established, and before trust has been built, tends to be processed through whatever frame the other person has already constructed, which is their frame, not yours. The same information introduced later, after relationship has developed and after you have had time to establish how you want to be understood, is processed through a context you have had time to shape. Timing disclosure is not manipulation. It is the recognition that communication is not a neutral transfer of data, but an act that happens inside a relationship and is therefore shaped by the state of that relationship at the moment of transfer. The person who understands this does not simply ask what to say. They ask when to say it, and the when frequently matters more than the what. The third dimension is audience. Not everyone deserves the same level of access to your interior. This is not a hierarchy of worth. It is a recognition that different relationships carry different levels of established trust, different histories of demonstrated reliability, and different alignments of interest. The colleague you have worked alongside for 2 months and the colleague you have known for a decade occupy genuinely different positions in relation to how much of your thinking is safe to share. The person whose interests consistently align with yours, and the person whose interests occasionally compete with yours, warrant different calibration of disclosure, regardless of how pleasant the interaction with each of them might be. One of the most common disclosure errors is extending the level of openness appropriate to a deep, trust-established relationship into a relationship that has not yet earned it. This error is usually made from social generosity, from a genuine desire to build connection quickly, to signal openness, to create warmth by offering intimacy. The intention is good. The consequence is frequently a transfer of information to someone who does not yet have the track record to handle it carefully. The fourth dimension of selective disclosure is perhaps the most sophisticated, and it is the one that most directly connects to influence. What you choose not to share creates space, and the human mind, encountering space in a conversation, encountering the sense that there is more to know than is currently visible, does not experience that space as empty. It fills the space with inference, with curiosity, with attention. The person who shares everything produces a complete picture. Complete pictures generate complete assessments. The assessment forms, the conclusion is drawn, the interest moves on. The person who shares selectively produces an incomplete picture. And incomplete pictures, in the particular way human psychology relates to incompleteness, generate continued engagement. The mind keeps working on what it has not yet resolved. The curiosity about what remains unshared keeps the attention alive in a way that complete disclosure cannot sustain. This is not a strategy for creating false mystique. It is an observation about how attention and interest actually function. Scarcity of information, in the same way as scarcity of anything, creates a specific quality of value. The person who speaks rarely and chooses their words with visible care produces a different reception than the person who offers their thoughts constantly and completely. The rare word carries more weight. The partial picture holds more attention. The person who is not fully legible sustains more interest than the person who is. The danger of selective disclosure, and it is a real danger worth naming directly, is that it can drift from discipline into concealment that damages trust. There is a clear line between choosing not to share what the situation does not require and actively creating false impressions through omission. The first is legitimate and often wise. The second is a form of deception that, in established relationships, carries costs that accumulate invisibly and present suddenly. The discipline of selective disclosure applies primarily to information about your positions, intentions, and vulnerabilities in contexts where those things are legitimately strategic. It does not apply to the fundamental honesty required by any relationship worth having. In close relationships, in the presence of genuine trust that has been built over time, selective disclosure becomes a barrier rather than a protection. The discipline of knowing when to open completely is as important as the discipline of knowing when to hold back. The clever person knows the difference, not through a formula, but through the practiced reading of context, relationship, and stakes that determines, in each specific situation, what the moment actually requires. Information is leverage. Manage it the way any serious person manages anything of genuine value, with attention, with judgment, and with a clear understanding that once spent, it cannot be unspent. Chapter 9. Reframing, the most underestimated cognitive tool. Before any decision is made in any room, something else has already happened. The situation has been defined. The terms have been established. The meaning of what is occurring has been assigned. And whoever assigned that meaning, whoever set the frame through which everyone else in the room is now processing the situation, is operating with an advantage that no subsequent argument, however well constructed, can fully overcome. This is the reality that most sophisticated thinkers eventually arrive at, usually after sufficient experience watching logically superior arguments fail to change outcomes in rooms where the frame was established by someone else before the argument began. The lesson, when it finally lands with full weight, tends to be decisive. The battle for outcomes is usually won or lost at the level of framing, not at the level of argument. Reframing is the capacity to change the frame, to shift the lens through which a situation is being interpreted, and in doing so, to change what conclusions naturally follow from the facts everyone agrees upon. It is, in the hands of a practiced mind, one of the most powerful tools available in any domain, where persuasion, influence, negotiation, or leadership is involved, and it is almost entirely invisible in operation. The best reframes do not announce themselves. They do not feel like a rhetorical move to the person receiving them. They feel like a new way of seeing something, a clarification, a widening of perspective, a revelation that the situation contains dimensions that were not previously visible. The person who has been reframed does not experience having been moved. They experience having understood something more fully. That invisibility is what makes reframing so structurally different from argument. Audiobook is a frontal engagement. It says, "Your position is wrong, and here is why." Even when executed with precision and generosity, argument triggers a defensive response in the person receiving it. The moment someone senses that their position is being challenged, the ego engages. The argument is no longer simply being evaluated for its logical content. It is being resisted because the acceptance of it would require an admission of error. And most human beings, regardless of intelligence, find the admission of error in public uncomfortable enough to generate resistance that is not entirely rational. Reframing bypasses this entirely. It does not challenge the position. It changes the position's environment, the context in which the position sits, and from which it draws its apparent meaning. When the environment changes, the position often collapses or becomes irrelevant without any direct attack on it. Consider the simplest possible illustration. Two people are discussing whether a glass contains enough water. The frame, the lens through which the discussion is happening, determines everything about how each of them experiences the facts. The same quantity of water, viewed through the frame of "this is all that remains," feels insufficient. Viewed through the frame of "this is what we have available to work with," it becomes a resource to be used rather than a lack to be mourned. The facts have not changed. Only the interpretive structure surrounding the facts has shifted. And that shift changes what responses make sense. This is a simple example. The mechanism scales to enormous complexity. In negotiation, reframing operates on the structure of the entire exchange. The negotiation that is framed as a competition, where one party gains what the other loses, produces a fundamentally different dynamic than the same negotiation reframed as a shared problem to be solved. The facts of each party's position may be identical in both framings. The emotional environment, the quality of information shared, the willingness to find creative solutions, and the ultimate outcome differ substantially. The person who introduces the collaborative frame, who shifts the conversation from adversarial to joint problem-solving, has not changed any of the substantive facts. They have changed the context in which those facts are being processed, and that change propagates through every subsequent interaction. In leadership, reframing is the difference between a crisis that paralyzes and a crisis that mobilizes. The same set of difficult facts, framed as evidence of failure, produces despair and defensiveness in the people who must respond to it. The same facts, framed as information revealing where work is needed, produces engagement, the leader who can hold the second frame genuinely, not as a performance of optimism, but as an authentic recalibration of meaning, shapes the response of everyone around them at a level no tactical instruction can reach. The first skill required to reframe effectively is the ability to see the existing frame clearly. This is less obvious than it sounds, because frames operate below the level of conscious awareness most of the time. They are the invisible structures that make certain questions seem natural and others seem beside the point. They determine what counts as evidence and what counts as noise. They establish what the right outcome looks like before any deliberation about how to reach it has begun. To see the frame, you have to step outside it. This requires a specific kind of deliberate detachment. the capacity to look at the interpretive structure surrounding a situation rather than through it. To ask, what assumptions are built into how this situation is being described? What does the current language make seem natural that might not actually be inevitable? What is being excluded from view by the way the problem has been defined? Most people in most situations never ask these questions. The frame is simply the shape of reality as they experience it. The person who can make the frame visible, first to themselves and then, carefully, to others, is operating with a degree of freedom that the person inside the frame does not possess. The second skill is construction, the capacity to build an alternative frame that reorients the situation in a way that is both genuinely true and more useful than the existing interpretation. This is the constraint that separates legitimate reframing from manipulation. The alternative frame must be honest. It cannot manufacture meaning that the facts do not actually support. It must reveal something that is genuinely present in the situation but was not previously visible. A dimension, a context, a possibility that the existing frame was excluding. When this condition is met, the reframe is not a distortion, it is an expansion. It makes the situation more complete, more legible, and more navigable. The people who experience it do not feel deceived. They feel that something has been clarified. The third skill is timing and tone. A reframe introduced too early, before the people in the room have had sufficient time to fully inhabit the existing frame, tends not to land. It feels premature. It has not yet been given the contrast that makes it illuminating. The frame that everyone has been living inside needs to have had enough time to reveal its limitations before an alternative becomes genuinely attractive, and the tone in which a reframe is introduced matters enormously. The reframe delivered with superiority, with any implicit message that the speaker's interpretation is obviously correct, and the audience's was obviously wrong, triggers exactly the defensive response that reframing is designed to bypass. The most effective reframes are introduced with genuine humility, as offerings rather than corrections, as possibilities being introduced for consideration, not verdicts being handed down. When done well, with accuracy, patience, and care, reframing does not feel like a move, it feels like a gift, a different lens, freely offered, that makes something complicated suddenly navigable. That invisibility is the mark of mastery. The clever mind does not fight the frame that was handed to it. It builds a better one and invites everyone else inside. Chapter 10. Emotional precision, feeling without being governed. Emotion is not the enemy of intelligence. That framing, common in certain traditions of self-improvement, implicit in the celebration of cold rationality as the ideal cognitive state, is both wrong and expensive. It is wrong because the research on how human beings actually make good decisions consistently implicates emotion as a necessary component, not an interference. And it is expensive because the person who treats their emotional life as a problem to be eliminated tends to lose access to some of the most reliable information available to them about what is real, what matters, and what is happening beneath the surface of any situation. The goal is not to become emotionless. The goal is precision. Emotional precision is the capacity to feel accurately, to interpret what you feel correctly, and to choose deliberately what role that feeling plays in your subsequent thinking and action. It is the difference between an emotion that informs and an emotion that commands, between feeling that operates as a signal and feeling that operates as a directive. Most people, in most situations, are not experiencing their emotions with this kind of precision. They are experiencing a much noisier version, a composite of the current stimulus, the accumulated history of similar stimuli, the social meanings attached to certain emotional states, the stories they habitually tell themselves about why they feel what they feel. This composite is rarely an accurate reading of the present moment. It is a present stimulus filtered through layers of past experience that may or may not be relevant to what is actually happening now. The result is that emotional responses, in most people most of the time, are carrying far more old information than new information. The anxiety that appears in a particular professional situation is not only a response to the current circumstances, it is also carrying forward the emotional residue of every similar situation that produced a bad outcome in the past. The anger that surfaces in a specific relational dynamic is not only a response to what just happened, it is activating a pattern of response that the nervous system developed in a different context, under different conditions, and is now applying whether or not the application is accurate. Emotional precision begins with the practice of separating these layers. When a strong emotion arises, the first question is not, what should I do with this feeling? It is, what is this feeling actually telling me about right now, as distinct from what it is telling me about my history with situations that resembled this one? This is a genuinely difficult practice. The emotional nervous system does not make neat distinctions between the present stimulus and the historical pattern. It responds to resonance. To the degree to which the current situation matches the template of situations it has learned to respond to in a particular way. And when the resonance is strong, the historical response arrives with the full force of the original learning, regardless of whether the current situation actually warrants it. Learning to ask the separating question, is this emotion giving me accurate information about now, or is it giving me familiar information about then? Does not eliminate the emotional response. It creates a layer of observation between the feeling and the action. And that layer, maintained with practice, is where precise interpretation becomes possible. The second element of emotional precision is calibration of intensity. Emotions exist on a spectrum of intensity, and the appropriate level of emotional engagement varies significantly across situations. An event that genuinely warrants a strong emotional response is different from an event that merely triggers a strong emotional response because of its resonance with historical patterns. These two events may feel identical from inside the experience of the emotion, but they are structurally different, and treating them identically, bringing the same level of emotional intensity to both, produces systematically poor calibration. The precisely calibrated emotional person brings appropriate weight to appropriate situations. They are genuinely moved by what is genuinely moving, genuinely disturbed by what is genuinely disturbing, and genuinely unmoved by what the situation does not warrant being moved by. This calibration is difficult to develop because it requires the practice of continuously checking the level of emotional response against an honest assessment of what the situation actually deserves. Most people never do this checking. They experience the intensity of the response as self-evidently appropriate, as evidence of how serious the situation is. And the brain, which uses emotional intensity as one of its primary inputs for assessing how important something is, tends to confirm this. The more strongly I feel this, the more it must matter. But this confirmation loop is precisely where calibration fails. Intensity of feeling and importance of situation are not the same thing. They correlate imperfectly and sometimes not at all. The third element is the use of emotion as intelligence. This is where the framing shifts most completely from the suppression model to the precision model. Emotion, experienced and interpreted accurately, carries information that pure logical analysis frequently cannot access. The discomfort that arises in a situation where something is wrong, but the wrongness has not yet been made explicit. The unease in a relationship that looks functional on the surface, but is producing a consistent low-level distress that the analysis cannot locate. The excitement that attaches to a direction that has not yet been rationally justified, but is pulling at something real in the person's understanding of where they should be going. These are not irrational signals to be dismissed. They are data from a processing system that operates faster and with access to information patterns that explicit analysis cannot always reach. The question is not whether to feel them, but how to interpret them with sufficient accuracy that they become useful rather than misleading. The practice of emotional precision involves building a relationship with your own emotional signals that is characterized by curiosity rather than either compliance or dismissal. When a feeling arrives, neither act on it automatically nor push it away. Sit with it, Ask what it is responding to. Ask what it might be telling you about the situation that you have not yet been able to articulate explicitly. Ask whether the intensity is proportionate. Ask whether the historical resonance is making the signal louder than the present circumstances warrant. This inquiry does not always produce clean answers. Sometimes the emotion is giving you precise, accurate information about the present moment, and the appropriate response is to act on it with full commitment. Sometimes it is transmitting historical noise that will lead you astray if you follow it. The practice of emotional precision is the practice of developing the capacity to tell the difference reliably, quickly, and without the kind of overthinking that transforms a useful signal into an endless internal debate. The person who achieves genuine emotional precision is neither cold nor reactive. They feel fully and they choose carefully. They bring the whole of their human experience to the situations they navigate, including the emotional dimensions that provide information no spreadsheet will ever contain. And they hold all of that experience with enough discipline that it informs rather than commands. This is what is meant by feeling without being governed. Not the suppression of the feeling, the elevation of the observer above the feeling, high enough to see what the feeling is actually about, and to choose what to do with that information rather than simply becoming it. That elevation is not a destination, it is a daily practice, and it is one of the most important practices in the entire architecture of clever thinking.